Hey guys, I'm Mike DeWard. I'm the youth pastor here at Parkview Church, and I want to welcome you guys to Parkview Student Ministries watch parties. So we have a couple of them around the area, and we're just excited that you're watching it either there in person, or if you end up watching it at some point during the week, we're just glad that you're here. And so one of the things, it is Father's Day when we're watching this, and I'm just going to assume that you guys have already been to church. And so because of that, I'm not going to rehash another Father's Day sort of message here. We're going to kind of do a little bit, something a little bit different. And so in that sort of case, just want you to bear with me. And so today what we're going to be doing is we're going to be looking at the Sermon on the Mount, and really just a little part of it, not a big part, but just a little bit, and really kind of getting home. And so the way I'd like to start it is to basically tell you a little story, a little bit about Mike. And the first thing I would tell you is Mike DeWard has a pretty impressive ability to sit in a room full of people and say the one thing that nobody else is thinking or desiring. And so what happens about 3 years ago, give or take, I was sitting in a room that was similar to the one here in 106 at Parkview. And it was actually at Clear Creek Humana High School, and just with a group of guys that I really love and enjoy spending time with. And they had all kind of been wounded by one of the guys who's kind of leading that particular group. And so we were kind of talking about different sort of things. And I remember sitting in that group, and I remember just kind of stopping and saying out loud with my mouth, like, okay, when can we get those guys in here so we can kind of hash this stuff out? And just realizing, like, as you're looking around and realizing that, oh, hey, nobody else really had that thought, and that's not really what we're doing here. And so that's kind of like a Mike DeWard thing that he does a fair amount. And so sticking out can be kind of a little bit different, and being different can be kind of frustrating. I think lots of kids really struggle with that idea of, like, am I different? Do I just go with the flow? Should I be my own person? And that sort of stuff. And so when we kind of look at the Sermon on the Mount, what we see is Jesus saying all these things. Hey, you've heard it before. Like, you've heard it from the Pharisees, you've heard it from the world, but he loves this but I statement, right? He's taking this old teaching, this old kind of reality of the way things are, and he's changing it to being what Jesus wants it to be, what it should be. And so in the Sermon on the Mount, he says this several times. You have heard it said, but I tell you. And so people really like this. People were flocking to this sort of message. And so when we kind of get in on the Sermon on the Mount, he's really a lot closer to halfway than he was at the beginning. And so if you look in Matthew 5:38 through 42, we're just going to read it here from the NLT, and you're going to hear Jesus' call to be different. Okay? So Jesus says, you have heard the law that says, the punishment must match the injury, an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth. But I say, do not resist an evil person. If someone slaps you on the right cheek, offer the other cheek also. If you are sued in court and your shirt is taken from you, give your coat too. If a soldier demands that you carry his gear for a mile, carry it 2 miles. Give to those who ask, and don't turn away from those who want to borrow. And so Jesus here, he's talking about the law, right? The law of Moses. And the actual reference here is Exodus 21:24. And it simply states that, like, if you lose something because of somebody else, you should get something equal in sort of return. So the idea is, like, if you steal something from me, you have to pay me back equal value of either a possession. So in that case, we're talking sheep and goats and stuff like that. And so, like, if you steal my favorite goat, like, you have to return goats to me in this sort of, like, eye for an eye. Like, you get the kind of give and take response. But Jesus says something more. Like, he's saying, you've heard it, right? You've heard it said this way, but and so here, if you go back to me in the 39 through 40, he says, but I say, do not resist an evil person. If someone slaps you on the right cheek, offer the other cheek also. If you are sued in court and your shirt is taken from you, give your coat too. Now, I do want to talk about the slap. We often talk about it, and if you've been in church at all, right, you hear, right, the first slap doesn't hurt, but, you know, when you offer up the backhand, right, you get this part of your hand, and it's bony and it hurts. But when you really think about a slap in this particular instance, in this, like, time in history, that first slap is actually an insult. So when we think about it in modern days, what we're thinking is, like, okay, so if someone insults you, right, we don't typically walk around slapping each other in the face when we're, like, mad at each other. I don't know about you, I don't, but it's fine, whatever. So anyways, somebody's walking around, they're upset. An insult is to slap you. A light slap, and it lets everybody know, like, hey, you're dumb, and I'm smart. And so when we think about that, when somebody does that, when somebody insults us, what do we want to do in return? Right? If somebody walks up and hits me, I immediately want to respond in kind. If someone walks up and insults me, I want to do the same thing. And what is Jesus saying here? What's his "but I say" statement? Okay? It's this, but I'm telling you, be different in the way that you respond to these insults, in the way that you respond personally to these sorts of things. He's not saying, hey, we're upending the whole justice system. That all of a sudden, if somebody does something, we just hold nobody accountable. That's what I'm saying. No, he doesn't say that. What he's saying here is that we, me and you, who follow Jesus, we should respond to these different kinds of inputs, right? These insults, these painful sort of endeavors in a different way than what the rest of the world does. And so when we think about this, right, if he's telling us to be different in those sorts of things, an easier way to say this is be different in the way that you forgive people. Because an eye for an eye requires no forgiveness, right? Revenge is when we try and hurt somebody who's hurt us. When we try and get even, right? We use that term to get even. I want to get back to zero. And Jesus is saying, hey, you can't get back to zero, because ultimately when you think about this, okay, when you've hurt somebody or when somebody's hurt you and then you go back and you do that same thing, now they're hurt. And this kind of injury sort of cycle continues. And so revenge is just this kind of dead end. And so Jesus is telling us, hey, avoid that whole situation. Avoid every part of that. But what I'm telling you is forgive other people. And so the question that, right, we ask is, but what about when people have really hurt me when I was younger? Okay, or maybe it's, the people that were my family, the ones that are supposed to love and care for me the most, and they've wounded me the most. Like, what am I supposed to do about that, Jesus? Or maybe it's that friend that you've had since elementary school that was supposed to be your BFF forever. Wow, great reference, Mike. But we just, what happens when that person lies about you or does something different? And Jesus says, hey, forgiveness is what we're searching for. Forgiveness is the gift that Jesus himself, that he offers us, right? When he's saying this, right, the people at this time don't understand really the purpose of what's going to happen. And what he's really pointing to is the gospel. That Jesus died for our sins so that the one person that we've hurt the most, the person has the most right to get even, which is God, no longer is attempting to get even because Jesus has taken that for us, from us. And so forgiveness stops being a gift, right, that only God gets or God gives to us, right? It's this thing that we can now give to other people. We can give to our own self. Okay, because when we hold on to all that pain, all that bitterness, that anger, okay, we really just end up with a very sick heart. And so it's really important for you guys to understand that Jesus is asking you to be different in the way that you forgive other people. But Jesus didn't just say that. So if you go back in Matthew, okay, 6:41 through 42, Jesus says this: if a soldier demands that you carry his gear for a mile, carry it 2 miles. Give to those who ask, and don't turn away from those who want to borrow. And so during this time, again, a little history lesson here. There's a wonderful saying that maybe some of you have heard from me, but it's this idea: all roads point to Rome. Okay, because in that particular period of time, Rome had gone out all the different places. They'd taken over Europe and the Middle East and North Africa, and they were like the biggest empire ever. And they really didn't care whether or not you were super cool. They came in, they took your stuff, and they didn't care if they had to kill you for it or otherwise. But you were going to be theirs, and they were going to own everything that you had. And they were going to oppress the people there, keep them down. Okay? And so when Jesus is saying, if a soldier demands that you carry this, they had this little rule where like a soldier could walk up and tap you on the shoulder and say, hey, carry whatever I want you to carry, and you have to do it for at least 1,000 steps. Like at least. And so Jesus is saying, hey, you've heard it that part, but I'm telling you to go one step beyond. To break that sort of like tradition where you're oppressed. No, we're doing this. We love you so much. And so be different in your relationship. Just like Like Jesus is asking the Jewish people who really did not like the Romans to carry that. And so we have to just understand the outrageous expectation that Jesus had of the Jews of that time. He has for us, even now. And so the relationships that we have to think, okay, so what is my purpose within this relationship? Okay, and when we think about that, right, our purpose becomes showing God's love, showing Jesus, the gospel of everything. And so a great way to look about how to get that kind of done is the way that Jesus responds to different people. And so the best way to look at this, I think it's a really great kind of social commentary here of the time, right? Jews and Romans didn't like each other, but Jews and Samaritans hated each other. Like, don't talk to them. They're dirty. They're bad. Like, avoid them. Like, if you're walking on the street, cross the street. Okay? If you're selling stuff, don't sell to them. Like, that's the kind of like, they don't like each other. And so Jesus ends up, okay, in John 4, taking a path, okay? He's going from one side to another side of Israel. And what he decides to do is go through Samaria. Where you shouldn't even go, he goes. And he meets this woman at the well. Now, most of you guys have probably heard of this particular story. And the idea is this, right? So Jesus ends up, he's walking, okay, it's John 4, 6 through 9. He's tired, he sits down at a well, and this woman comes up in the middle of the day, noon. Okay, if you guys have seen the Middle East, I have a brother-in-law who's stationed there. My understanding is don't go anywhere in the middle of the day. It's awful. And so the only two people who are at this well in the middle of the day is Jesus who's traveling and this woman, which means nobody else wanted to be there. And so Jesus ends up talking to her, right? And he's like, hey, how's it going, right? And she ends up asking him, hey, she's setting up this cultural problem, right? You are a Jew and I am a Samaritan woman. Why are you asking me for a drink? And they continue to have a conversation. Jesus talks to her, gets to know her, tells her things about herself. And then eventually his disciples come back and this happens. So if you look in 4:26, and it says, they were shocked to find him talking to a woman, but none of them had the nerve. What do you want with her? Because there are two things that Jesus broke, right? The first one was the gender roles. Man wasn't supposed to talk to a woman, but it's not just that. You're not supposed to talk to a Samaritan. And so when we look at this, as we look at kind of the problems that we have right now as a nation, the problems that we have within our own kind of just home sort of life here in Iowa City, North Liberty, Coralville, all of those sorts of areas, Jesus kind of shows what we need to do in response to this kind of pain and hurt. The first thing as you look at that kind of story is you need to sit down and have a conversation. And the important part of that conversation is that you treat them like Jesus treated the Samaritan woman, that they have value, that they were created in the image of God. And so you have that conversation, you set that up, that they're important to you. And then the second step is that you get to know them, right? You build a relationship with them. Words in a vacuum, words without love don't mean anything. And then the last thing he says, and it's just before the disciples come back, he tells her, I am the Messiah. He shares the basic understanding of the gospel. And so in a lot of cases, what we end up doing in these sorts of things as we think about relationships and being different in those relationships is we need to have a lot of those conversations. We need to have those conversations to have forgiveness, right? You need to have conversations where you let people know that you've been hurt or wounded and that sort of stuff. And in that same sort of sense, as we deal with this kind of problem that we have as a culture, sit down with people, get off the social media, and go sit down with someone that you know that's hurting or cares, okay? And build that relationship and ultimately share the gospel, okay? You don't want to skip steps and you don't want to fast forward to the end. People don't need to hear the truth before they know that you care about them, okay? And so just as we go into small groups, I just want you to think about this. The goal here for us in this youth group, in our lives, is to be different. Jesus doesn't call us to be the same as everyone else. And so go and let's talk about this as a group. And thanks for coming.